So we're doing a presentation on water quality and stressors in the Severn Sound watershed and how to make a difference. And I'll let Aisha start.
All right, so some of you might have varying levels of familiarity with Severn Sound and sort of the story behind why the monitoring here is such a big deal, and why it's so thorough and sort of important to continue on. So Severn Sound was actually listed as an area of concern on the Great Lakes, and the amount of nutrients in the water was sort of a major factor in becoming an area of concern. So the amount of algae growth that was occurring out in the open waters was quite severe, and it was identified that there was a lot of nutrient sources on the landscape within the watershed that needed to be controlled, amongst some other habitat related issues as well, bacteria on beaches, stuff like that. But the nutrients was really kind of the primary story here. And so a remedial action plan was developed with partnerships with Environment Canada and Ministry of Environment, but also all the municipalities within the Severn Sound watershed, and working with residents and local community groups as well. So there was a lot of emphasis on nutrient load reduction, sort of targeting phosphorus. So things like the picture you see here, stream bank restoration, tree planting and stewardship projects, fencing livestock, cattle, and that sort of thing out of streams really made a difference. And so in 2003, we were actually taken off that list of areas of concern, under the condition that we continue to monitor the watershed and the open waters to make sure that we're not slipping back to conditions that were experienced before. And so the SSA continues to do that water quality monitoring, both in the open waters of Severn Sound, in all the inland lakes across the watershed, and in tributaries. So we continue to look at nutrients and algae and sort of that lower food web, but also looking at impacts of newer stressors. Well, not that it's that new now, but climate change, invasive species, and just continued changes on the landscape as population expansion occurs. So some of the monitoring programs that we have, and today I'll be focusing on the Severn Sound open waters that we monitor, and inland lakes, as I mentioned. Invasive species monitoring has been ongoing for a number of years. And then we also undertake through a couple of different provincial programs. We're part of their monitoring network, so we get some support through those programs. So the Water Quality Monitoring Network, which focuses on rivers, sort of larger tributaries. And then we also have a groundwater program that we can sample groundwater as well. And then a couple of different programs that I won't touch on today, but we do sample stream invertebrates, sort of to have another indicator of stream health, and then climate monitoring. So we have a couple of climate monitoring locations, and then also specifically for rainfall. And so the data that you collect as volunteers, for those of you that have rain gauges, it's really helpful to have that information to sort of fill in any gaps across the watershed in terms of that rainfall data. So this map is just showing our open water as well as the inland lake and tributary monitoring sites. So they're all color coded differently here. And so I'm going to talk about sort of the conditions at these sites sort of as a grouping, and just to give you sort of a sense of how things have changed across the watershed. So we're going to focus on some of the major water quality stressors, and so these are sort of in line with what Ted was talking about, when looking at Lake Huron sort of in a bigger picture. It's really the same sort of stressors that we're seeing in Severn Sound as well. So these things will impact not only biological communities in the lake, but also human uses of the lake and our ability to either use the water for drinking water or recreational purposes, and just sort of general enjoyment. So excessive nutrients, which can lead to algae blooms, climate change, as we mentioned, and the effects that can have on ecosystems, and also sort of the physical nature of the open water. So in terms of water level change, and then also invasive species. So kind of looking at nutrients from the ground up, that really forms the backbone of a lake ecosystem. So without nutrients, you wouldn't have any life in the lake at all. So we do need some level of all three nutrients listed here: carbon, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And so the phosphorus tends to be what's the limiting nutrient for algae growth. And so we have many different classes of algae that will form a community in the lake. And this in turn forms a backbone for the higher levels of the food web, which are the zooplankton. So these really cute, tiny little invertebrates that live, swim around in the water, and they munch away on the algae and sort of keep it under control. And then they in turn provide food for the fish that eat plankton. So these little tiny invertebrates. They'll also eat algae sometimes as well. And then these smaller fish will in turn feed the bigger fish. So this is a whole picture that we sort of need to keep every level of this food web intact and sort of in the right balance. So if you have too much nutrients leading to too much algae growth, this can affect, things like the amount of oxygen in the water, affecting fish populations, and likewise zooplankton levels can affect in either direction in that food web. And so here, basically just to show that, so in terms of phosphorus, as I mentioned, sort of that limiting factor for algae growth, it's quite a complex nutrient in the sense that you will find it in different parts of a lake ecosystem. So bound up both in biological material, like in the algae itself and in the fish, in the bacteria and all that. And so as those things kind of die off and decompose, that phosphorus will get deposited into the sediment or sometimes resuspended back into that cycle. And then we also have inputs from external sources. So these can be both natural sources and also human-related sources. So some of those human sources would include things like both animal and human waste. So whether it's from a septic system or a wastewater treatment plant, or dog feces on a beach, to manure that's on a farm. So all of these different sources of excrement. We can also have artificial fertilizers that are put onto lawns and that sort of thing. And then stormwater runoff can be quite a significant source of nutrients as well. So looking at some of the different things that we're seeing across the watershed, so looking at tributaries. So these are some of the downstream tributary locations that we monitor. So going all the way back to, for most of these sites, back to the mid-90s. And you can see that the phosphorus concentrations, so shown here as well is the provincial water quality objective. So for river locations, that's 30 micrograms per liter. And you can see that earlier in the 90s and mid 2000s that it was fairly frequent that we had concentrations that were above that objective. But if you look kind of the last decade, we don't tend to see high concentrations as frequently. And when we do, they tend to be related to higher flow events. So, a big storm that comes through will send through a big pulse of nutrients. Looking at the phosphorus at some of our Severn Sound monitoring locations. So a bit of a different type of graph here. So each graph shows you a different location across Severn Sound. So the P1, P2, those are different stations that we monitor. And the color of the graph there corresponds to the key map that's down in the corner. So it's basically just showing concentration over time. And the size of that box, as you're looking at the graph, is basically just how big of a spread in the data are we seeing sort of in each season. So as we go along through time, we tend to see less of a spread across the season, so less variability within each year. And then also that concentrations are coming down. And that's really the key take home here, is that for a lot of the sites that we've been monitoring since the 70s have been coming down over time. We do have quite a few locations that have not been monitored for quite as long. They started sort of in either the late 90s or mid 2000s, and those sites haven't really shown a change. So if we look at the information basically from about mid 90s to present, the amount of phosphorus hasn't really changed so much over time. So we're not continuing to see that decrease. So things are holding fairly steady at those locations, which is good to see, but might play into some of the different algae trends that we've been seeing, which I'll touch on in a moment. So shifting to some of our inland lakes, you can see all the 6 different lakes that we monitor on a regular basis. So these lakes are sampled sort of in different years, so the graphs are not consistent across the board. But for the most part, again, we've seen some declines in phosphorus, or at least holding steady in these water bodies. But what you will notice, and I've tried to label here, so basically between 0 to 10 micrograms per liter would be considered a low nutrient lake. Between 10 to 20 is moderate, and then anything above 20, you're getting into a high nutrient state where you're likely going to have algae growth issues. And so some of the lakes across Severn Sound are in very different categories, depending on the characteristics of the lake. So if you can kind of find where your favorite spot is and see what the conditions are there, it might be very different than the nearest lake next to it. So for example, McLean Lake is quite high nutrient and for various reasons. And so there are algae growth issues there, particularly blue-green algae, versus Lake Couchiching, which is fairly low nutrient, partly because there's a lot of zebra mussels in that lake that tend to filter out a lot of that particulate phosphorus and algae growth. So moving on to algae, it kind of gets a bad rap. It is an important part of the food web, but it's really just when it gets out of control that we see negative effects there. So algae growth is controlled by several different factors here, so temperature, light, nutrients, and the amount of water movement. So looking at, I sort of briefly mentioned, but the amount of algae in the open waters of Severn Sound has really been declining at most locations across Severn Sound, with the exception of some areas up in Honey Harbour where we have been seeing an increase, and that's something that we're working with Township of Georgian Bay and some of the residents up there to try and manage sources of nutrients that might be contributing to that algae growth. And the amount of algae that's in the water really plays into the clarity of the water. So in a lot of locations where algae growth might be starting to increase, then we see a corresponding drop in how clear the water is. And so that can have implications for both fish communities as well as people's enjoyment of the water. If it's not very clear, it doesn't look nice to swim in. And this can also be related to zebra mussels that are growing in different parts of Severn Sound. They really filter out the water, and so it can have an impact on the clarity there. Looking specifically at algae in the inland lakes across the watershed, again, pretty different depending on which lake you're looking at. So again, if we look at McLean Lake, we have quite high abundance of algae there. And if you look at that light blue color, so that's the blue-green algae. So that's the type of algae that can actually produce toxins in the water and that we might be a little bit more concerned about. So when we see that blue-green algae taking up, half or more of the total algae abundance, that's when we start to get, concerned that we have a problem there that needs to be addressed. So for the most part, we don't see blue-green algae issues across the inland lakes. We do sometimes see small blooms that will pop up for a short period of time. So for example, in Little Lake, there have been some blooms across part of the beach areas that tend to be relatively short-lived, but definitely something to keep an eye on. So another stressor that we look at is climate change. And so this is really a stressor that can magnify the effects of other stressors in the watershed, namely nutrients. And so what we're seeing is an increase in air temperature that's fueling an increase in water temperature, which can have in turn an impact on the amount of algae and bacterial growth. And so across Severn Sound in the surface waters, we've actually seen an increase of 0.4 degrees Celsius per decade, so sort of from that May to October period, and then double that rate of increase in the fall. So this can really have implications as far as delaying the onset of ice cover, and also the amount of algae growth that can occur in the fall season. So these don't sound like very high numbers, but over a 50-year period, you start to look at a 2 degree increase, which is pretty significant. Other impacts of climate change, so things like seeing increased winter rainfall across the watershed and increased storm activity. Definitely seeing more high wind events, which when the water levels are high can really lead to effects on shoreline erosion, that sort of thing. So Sustainable Severn Sound is a special project within SSEA. And if you're interested to see sort of specifically what your municipality is doing to deal with climate change, you can visit the website here, and there's detailed action plans that we've been working on with those partner municipalities. So I encourage you to check those out. And there's definitely information on what residents can do to help mitigate climate change impacts. And Emily, I'll turn it over to you.
Alrighty. So I'm going to talk a little bit about invasive species. So there's a cool little flow chart here that just helps you identify if that species you're looking at is in fact invasive. So the major factor is the species outside its natural or past distribution due to human activities. And then the second part is that species having a negative impact on the environment, the economy or society, including human health. Next slide. And then these are just examples of common invasive species that have been found throughout the watershed. So there's Phragmites, as many of you probably know, as a huge nuisance. It's very difficult to get rid of. It outcompetes the species around it. There's mystery snails, which also outcompete native species and can really accumulate on substrates, as well as zebra mussels. And then we've got our aquatic plants. So we've got starry stonewort, which some of you are monitoring for through the invasive species spotters program. So this creates really dense mats, and this can be a problem for fish populations, as well as Eurasian water milfoil, which also creates dense mats, and when it dies off can deplete dissolved oxygen levels, which can negatively affect fish populations as well. All right, so now that we've given you our outline and some stressors on water quality in the watershed, here's some things that you can do about it. So on your own property, so this applies whether you live close to the water or not. One of the best things you can do is minimize impervious surfaces on your property. So these are things like paved driveways or patios. These surfaces, water runs off them very easily and can carry excess nutrients and pollutants into the stream, which eventually end up in our lakes. And then along with paved surfaces, manicured lawns are not very good at absorbing rainfall and can increase runoff. So the easiest way to fix both these problems is to plant plants. So you want to create as much native and natural spaces on your lawn as possible, as this will help absorb runoff and lead to less excess nutrients ending up in our water bodies. And so the SSEA has tree planting programs. So if you're interested in that, you can reach out to us and we can provide you some more information on that. And then another important factor is eliminating fertilizers from your lawn care. So particularly those containing phosphorus, as these can also lead to excess nutrients in the stream, which can lead to algae blooms. And then bonus is if you have less lawn, you have less to mow. So it's less work for you, and it'll be good for our lakes and streams. All right, so if you're lucky enough to live on waterfront property, there's some extra steps you can take. So you can create a natural buffer zone on your property between your lawn and the water. A buffer zone is important as it helps filter out any excess nutrients that may otherwise go directly into the lake or stream. Ideally, you want 30 meters deep of a buffer, and that should cover about 75% of the shoreline. This can seem like quite a lot, but if you make it a community goal on your lake or on your stream, you can work together to increase your shoreline buffer. Increased vegetation in general along shorelines or stream banks can also help with erosion that happens due to high flows in streams or high increasing water levels, as well as boat traffic and waves. So if you take a look at the two aerial photos on this slide, the top one is a section of shoreline that has very little buffer, whereas the bottom one is a natural cover that's been maintained along the shoreline. And then the other photo is just a more detailed idea of what a natural shoreline can look like. So it's important to also encourage native plant growth, both terrestrial and aquatic, as it helps improve your buffer zone and also creates important habitat for invertebrates and fish. And the last thing that you can do is to not restrict water movement around your docks. So to do this, you want to use pipe or floating docks, as the water can still move around it, and you want to avoid using U-shaped or L-shaped docks, as this can lead to stagnant water and then algae blooms can occur. And also using floating docks helps with the rising water levels. Right, so if you have a septic tank on your property, it's important that you maintain your septic tank with regular pump outs and inspections. So this is 3 to 5 years, depending on the use. You want to reduce septic output by using efficient water fixtures in your home. You don't want to pour chemicals down your drains or any other products that could affect how your septic tank functions. And then lastly, something that everyone can do, even if you have a septic tank or not, is you can use environmentally friendly products in your home, specifically ones that are phosphate free. And that's, you know, your cleaning supplies, personal hygiene products, and laundry detergent. And then lastly, we're just going to touch on a little bit that you can do to stop the spread of invasive species. So boot brushing is a practice that is good to take, where you, at the end of your hike or a recreational activity, you take a hard brush and you just remove any seeds or material that's attached to your boots. And that also applies to any equipment you're using as well, so bicycles or ATVs. And this just helps stop the spread of any invasive species that might have attached to that equipment, and you're not spreading it to other locations or back to your home. And then to prevent the spread of aquatic invasive species, you can use the clean, drain, dry protocol. So to do this, you want to clean your watercraft by inspecting and removing any plants, invertebrates, and mud. And you can do this either by hand or by using a pressure washer if you have one. Once you're done cleaning it, you want to drain all the water from that equipment, and you want to do this away from any water body, so you're not pushing all that dirt and mud and invertebrates back into the water system. And then lastly, you want to make sure that all of this dries completely. So when possible, it's best to leave out in the sun for at least 5 days. And this is especially important when you're moving equipment from one water body to another.